I worked inside Princess Anne's household for many years, not in public view and never beside cameras, but close enough to see how each day truly unfolded. To the public, Princess Anne is admired as dependable, hard-working, and unemotional in the most respectable sense. Many consider her the most grounded royal of her generation. That description is not inaccurate, but it is incomplete. Inside the household, warmth was never expected, and it was never offered. This was not cruelty, it was design. From the very beginning, there was an unspoken understanding that feelings did not belong to the schedule. Efficiency did. Conversations were brief, instructions were clear, and silence was comfortable. No one waited for encouragement, and no one looked for praise. If something was done correctly, it required no comment. If it was done incorrectly, it was simply never repeated. Princess Anne did not raise her voice, because she never needed to. Her presence alone set the tone. People often assume that emotional distance means emotional absence. That assumption would be a mistake. What existed instead was control, discipline, and a refusal to allow personal feeling to interfere with responsibility. Those who expected reassurance did not remain long. Those who understood restraint stayed. This side of Princess Anne was never meant to be hidden. It simply was not considered relevant to the public story. Inside the household, however, it defined everything. What the public got wrong. The public often believes Princess Anne is emotionally distant because she simply does not care to engage. That interpretation is convenient, but it is wrong. Inside the household, emotional distance was never a flaw. It was a requirement. People assumed her reserve meant detachment, yet what it truly represented was discipline refined over decades. There was a common belief that Princess Anne was difficult to work with. That word was never used internally. The reality was simpler and less forgiving. She expected competence without reassurance. She valued results over sentiment. Staff who mistook courtesy for comfort quickly realized the difference. Politeness existed, but it never softened expectation. The palace often praised her work ethic publicly, but few understood how uncompromising that ethic was behind closed doors. There were no allowances for mood, fatigue, or personal circumstance. The schedule did not adjust for emotion. It moved forward regardless. This was not indifference. It was consistency. Many assumed that Princess Anne's lack of visible warmth reflected an absence of empathy. In practice, empathy was expressed through trust rather than words. If responsibility was given, it was not revisited. If a task was assigned, it was expected to be completed without supervision. That confidence was rarely acknowledged, but it was deliberate. Those unfamiliar with this environment often mistook silence for disapproval. In reality, silence usually meant satisfaction. Praise was unnecessary because repetition was proof enough. When a task was done correctly, it became routine. When it was not, it quietly disappeared from one's responsibilities. The public story portrays Princess Anne as unyielding by nature. The truth was more structured than personal. Her approach was shaped by duty, not temperament. Emotion was not rejected. It was simply kept separate from obligation. Inside the household, this distinction was clear to everyone who remained long enough to understand it. The side never meant to be seen. In private, there were habits no one discussed openly, not because they were shocking, but because they contradicted everything the public believed about Princess Anne. The household ran on an unspoken code that was learned quickly or not at all. Punctuality was not a preference. It was assumed. Preparation was not praised. It was expected. Any explanation longer than necessary was quietly discouraged. Princess Anne had little tolerance for repetition. If instructions had to be clarified more than once, responsibility was reassigned without comment. This was not humiliation. It was efficiency. Staff learned that questions were welcome only if they served precision, not reassurance. Once an answer was given, it was final. There was no second conversation. There was also a clear boundary between professional proximity and personal familiarity. Friendly behavior was not mistaken for closeness. No one was invited into emotional space simply because they were present daily. Personal stories were not exchanged. Sympathy was not solicited. The household functioned on respect rather than rapport. What surprised new staff most was not severity, but restraint. Princess Anne did not monitor people closely. She noticed patterns instead. If reliability was demonstrated, attention diminished. If inconsistency appeared, distance followed. This quiet withdrawal was understood as correction. No confrontation was required. There were days when fatigue was visible, but never acknowledged. Personal discomfort was treated as irrelevant to duty. The expectation was not that one should endure silently, but that one should manage privately. That standard applied to everyone, including Princess Anne herself. Silence was the most misunderstood element of the household. It was not a sign of tension. It was a sign of alignment. When the household was quiet, it meant everything was functioning as intended. Noise suggested inefficiency. Calm indicated control. This side of Princess Anne was never hidden deliberately. It simply existed beyond the reach of public curiosity. Those who worked within it understood that emotional distance was not absence, but containment. It was the structure that allowed everything else to function without disruption. The conflict between discipline and the palace. The palace often prides itself on structure, but structure within an institution is not the same as discipline within a person. Princess Anne embodied the latter, and that distinction gradually created tension. While the palace relied on procedure, consensus, and careful presentation, Princess Anne relied on decisiveness. She did not wait for alignment. She expected readiness. There were moments when her approach conflicted quietly with palace expectations. Not publicly, and never dramatically, but internally, the difference was felt. Committees preferred deliberation. Princess Anne preferred execution. Advisors favored caution. She favored clarity. When schedules shifted or priorities changed, she adapted without discussion. The palace, by contrast, required explanation. This was not rebellion. It was incompatibility. Princess Anne did not challenge the institution openly, but she did not soften herself to accommodate it either. She fulfilled obligations exactly as required, but nothing more. There was no effort to appear accommodating, no interest in reassurance, and no patience for ambiguity. Those around her understood that she did not seek influence within the palace. She sought effectiveness. That distinction made her difficult to manage, not because she resisted authority, but because she did not depend on it. She did not ask how something should be handled if the outcome was already clear. She acted, then moved on. The palace attempted to standardize her approach by assigning intermediaries, refining schedules, and clarifying expectations. None of it altered her behavior. She complied precisely with what was asked, but she never adjusted how she thought. Control existed on paper. Independence remained in practice. This created a subtle but persistent friction. Princess Anne became respected, but increasingly isolated, not excluded, but distinct. She operated parallel to the system rather than within it. The palace could rely on her, but it could not shape her. In an institution built on uniformity, this was unsettling. Princess Anne did not disrupt the crown. She exposed its limits. Her discipline could not be absorbed, only tolerated. And that quiet resistance, unspoken and unresolved, became the defining conflict of her role. What was lost when warmth was never required? History remembers Princess Anne as resilient, reliable, and unwavering. She is often described as the royal who never faltered, never complained, and never required reassurance. That reputation is well earned. It is also incomplete. What was lost was not efficiency. The household never lacked order. Duties were fulfilled, schedules maintained, and expectations met without hesitation. What faded quietly was something less measurable. Emotional accessibility was never cultivated, and over time, it was no longer expected. Those who worked closest learned not to seek acknowledgement, not because it was denied, but because it was irrelevant. Professional respect replaced personal connection. Trust existed, but it was expressed through responsibility rather than closeness. This created stability, but it also created distance. The palace benefited from Princess Anne's discipline. It relied on her consistency and her refusal to complicate duty with sentiment. Yet in doing so, it accepted a version of service that left little room for softness. The institution endured. The system functioned. But the environment became narrower. Princess Anne did not lose anything she valued. She never sought warmth as validation. She did not measure success through affection. What may have been lost belonged not to her, but to those around her who mistook restraint for absence. In choosing control over comfort, she preserved her role with remarkable clarity. But the cost of that clarity was a silence that lingered long after tasks were completed and corridors emptied. The household remained efficient. It also remained emotionally quiet. The crown continues, supported by figures like Princess Anne who embodied duty without compromise. Yet within that endurance lies a subtle absence. Not scandal, not regret. Simply the absence of something human that was never considered essential enough to protect. That absence is not remembered in public history. It exists only in the recollections of those who stood close enough to notice it.